Hello, welcome to the Funky Wrench channel. My name is Louie, and this is the first installment in a series of videos in which I reorganized the back wall of my shop. I'm going to cover a couple things in this video, the first of which is how to break down existing furniture to give yourself the best yield of reusable pieces. And the second thing I will go over is how I will organize my everyday hardware storage. In a future video, I will expand on that storage system, so be on the lookout for that. But in the meantime, let's jump in. The first thing I did was empty the cabinet of its contents and fish it out of the corner. Every shop has a junk corner. This is mine. Don't judge. Next, I set about removing the top, doors, and back, and separating the two carcasses from each other. Then I continued with the removal theme and removed every single screw. And I made sure to double check that I got all of them. I'd hate to blow out a screw hole and ruin a piece I plan to reuse. And yes, I used drywall screws as pocket screws. And no, I have no regrets. Oh, hey there, buddy. Hey. Oh, he's freaking out. Once the screws were out, I went around and applied force to some parts to see if they would just play nice and let go. This worked for a few pieces, but for the more stubborn parts, I got out the old persuader. A couple of delicately placed whacks, and we were on our way. So the next method of removal that I'm going to try is to just take a box cutter and run it along the seam and see if I can get anything to loosen up. I'm still learning how to do this as I go. You're learning with me. That's the fun of it. The box cutter method seems to be working. I have loosened it up quite a bit. It's free down here on this end. Now I'm just going to use a hammer, see if I can loosen it up more. On the next carcass, after removing all of the screws, I wanted to try some other methods of delicate destruction. So to start, I broke out the flush trim saw. And I know doing things by hand is a little more tedious, but I find the flush trim saw to be very satisfying. You're getting carried away. Stop it. The next method I didn't manage to capture on video, but here are the results. Oops. So with the first cabinet completely apart, I moved on to my old hardware storage cabinet. Once again, I started by removing the screws and hardware. The parts from this cabinet were more integral to the future builds, so I brought out the track saw. Which I realize not everyone has a track saw, but with a little patience and a straight edge, most of these cuts can be made with a regular circular saw. The track saw was by far the best method of delicate destruction. Just put the track right on the seam and get to cutting. After I had cut all that I could reach with the track saw, I had to switch tactics. So I pulled out the oscillating multi-tool. This was by far my least favorite, as it was the dustiest, the loudest, and took the longest of any other method. However, it worked effectively, and I could not think of a better tool to make these inside cuts. If you can think of a tool better suited for this application, leave it in the comments down below. Finally, I could stand up on my feet like a dignified adult and make the last separations with my table saw.
And with that, I had successfully deconstructed 2 cabinets and was left with a mountain of good-sized pieces that I could reuse for future builds. I could now turn my attention to my new hardware organization system.
A while back, Laura Kampf put out a video explaining her new hardware storage system using sustainers from Thanos. And the thing I loved most about her system was the color coordination of the T-lock relative to the size of hardware. So a black T-lock means one size, a white T-lock a different size, and so on. I also think that a sustainer is the perfect size for a hardware organizer. They're about 16 by 12. And while I would love to fill my shop with sustainers, the cost is quite preventative. So I did some research and I found a relatively cheap option that you can buy at the home center. And these are about the same size as a sustainer and roughly 1/10 of the cost. Link to Laura's video will be in the description, by the way. So I took some time to muse on these organizers and I came up with a solution that I think is going to be perfect for me and my shop. Let me walk you through my thought process. First, I had to figure out the color coordination. And you'll notice that the latches on these organizers pop off pretty easily. So my first thought was, oh cool, I can just spray paint these to whatever color I need. But then I realized I would have to buy a bunch of spray paint and I didn't really want to spend any more money on this project, and then the spray paint would just take up space in the drawer. But then I remembered that I already had a bunch of colorful electric tape. So I realized I could just easily wrap the tape around the latches, and it was a solution that I already had in my shop. Then, to further satisfy the satisfaction level of this project, I brought out the P-Touch. Wow! As I filled a compartment, I put a label on it. And as I filled an organizer, I put a label on the tape. And I labeled what type of head each fastener had in each organizer. I also cut some extra dividers, which I could easily hot glue in should I need to. For some of the longer bolts, I cut out some of the dividers, which I did guilt-free since these organizers are less than $8 a piece. You can't beat that. So with the new system in place, it was time to build a shelf to hold it.
This shelf will hold 24 of these organizers, which is more than I can fill right now, but room for expansion is always nice. I started by cutting down some of those reclaimed parts from earlier, and all the parts in this cabinet were the same width, so I could set up the table saw and run everything through real quick. I brought out the crosscut sled to cut the sides to length. Then I jumped over to my temporary miter saw station, set up a stop block, and cut the top, bottom, and shelves to length. Around this time, I made a big mistake, but more on that later. And if you want to see me build a miter saw station for this saw, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications as that video is coming soon. Next, I had a little bit of cleanup to do. Since these pieces came from previous builds, they still had some glue residue and very thin layers of wood on them. But a combination of sanding, chiseling, and hand planing made quick work of this process. Then, after pre-drilling all my holes, it was time to assemble. To help with the assembly process, I used corner clamps. You can buy these in a variety of styles, but I just cut some L shapes out of plywood and used furniture clamps to hold them in place. The corner clamps also help to ensure that my shelf will be square. And there's no fancy joinery here, just pre-drill, glue, then screw. With the frame together, I could start to add the shelves. And right here is where you will see my mistake.
What happened here?
You see, what had happened was, I cut these shelves thinking the top and bottom would overlap the sides, and not that the sides would overlap the top and bottom.
Big old mistakes were made. Boop. Putting together the hardware storage, take 2. Now with plywood. Alright, cut a bunch of these spacers, which will eventually become dividers for each individual container. I clamped 2 of these dividers on each side. So that way I can just add glue to each side and then drop each shelf in there. Conveniently, I have already marked where each nail is going to go.
After the first shelf is in, it's rinse and repeat. Next, I traced out where the dividers would go, and then I added them in. I just put glue on each side of the divider and slid it in place. I didn't even use fasteners for this. They were such a tight fit that they stayed in place for the glue to dry. The last thing to do for the assembly of this shelf was to add a back. So I just grabbed some scrap masonite, cut it to size, and screwed it on. With the assembly finished, I can move on to the installation.
So originally I was going to build some sort of a bracket so that the hardware organizer would sit directly on this cabinet. And that's why I stopped and built the cabinet first. But now I have the cabinet in the space and I don't like that idea at all. So I'm going back to the original idea and we're gonna mount it to the wall. Here's how we're gonna do that.
On the back wall of my shop, there are these I-beams that were installed to reinforce the foundation of the house. Using these to mount the hardware shelf seemed like a better idea than drilling holes directly into the foundation. I started by measuring the inside of the I-beams and cut a 2x4 to length off camera. The plan is for this 2x4 to hold the weight of the hardware shelf. Next, I marked and drilled some holes in the I-beams, then clamped the 2x4 in place and drilled corresponding holes. I could then attach the 2x4 permanently with some 3/8 inch bolts.
Very sturdy. To mount the top of the hardware organizer, I will drill 2 holes on this side. 1.25 inches worth of material makes this flush. Screw those in. Then put the hardware organizer up there. Screw into this. Then drill a bigger hole and run a carriage bolt through this whole thing. I think that should hold it. If it doesn't, I'll add more hardware. Okay, time to put these bolts in. What you think, Onyx? Yeah? So there you have it, how to get the best reuse of your old shop furniture and a brand new hardware storage system. I hope you learned something from this video or were at least entertained. Part 2 of the back wall build is coming soon, so be sure to like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell. Thanks for tuning in to the Funky Wrench channel. I will see you on the next one.